Good evening, everyone. Welcome, thanks for coming. I should say, Borech Habe, Bilchem Aboyim, Shalom Aleichem. This is a very special event and very excited to see you all here. I know there are some other things going on, like, I don't know what, UWM's out of the tournament, so why are people watching the Badgers? I'm not sure. But there are some things like that, but glad to be with you tonight for a very, very special event. I'll tell you a little bit more about the workshop that's connected to this in a moment. I will start by just saying a few words of thanks, first of all, to all of you for coming out tonight. Second, to my really fantastic colleagues and friends from all over. Really excited to get 10 out of the 14 of us together in one place for several days to brainstorm about Yiddish theater projects from the UK, from various parts of the Northeast, and from various parts of the West Coast and Vancouver. So really excited that you could all be here, and we've had a wonderful day of discussions. And I'd like to especially thank Deborah Kaplan, who helped me put this group together in this project and has been instrumental in figuring out how to do this workshop. I would like to thank co-sponsors for this is part of a series that we're doing for the entire year called Art and Conflict, Ashkenaz and Beyond. And our partners are various UWM organizations, the Center for 21st Century Studies, Center for International Education, Cultures and Communities Program, History Department, and the wonderful UWM libraries, as well as a number of community partners, the Coalition for Jewish Learning, Harry and Rose Sampson Jewish Community Center, Jewish Community Relations Council, Hillel Milwaukee, Jewish Museum Milwaukee, and the Milwaukee Jewish Foundation. Also, special thanks to my staff, Shelley Durda, for helping publicize this very vigorously. And I really can't thank Karen Dredge enough for an unbelievable amount of work and preparation and grace under fire, because things inevitably come up. And Karen, we really just could not be doing this without you. I think various people will be lost in airports somewhere or something like that. I'll say a bit more in a moment, but I want to bring up Ann Panter, Director of Major and Planned Giving, to say a few words. Ann.
Thank you. That might make you all a little bit nervous with my title, and only because it mentions giving. And so I'll talk about that in a minute. But let me welcome you as well and thank those of you who are close to the Sam and Helen Style Center for Jewish Studies and supporters. It's so important, and we truly appreciate that. You're in for a treat tonight. Joe was telling me that we've got the best in the world here, and to be able to do that, the center and the work that Joel does and the courses that are the work that Joel does and the community events are supported to a large degree by people who are aligned with the mission, and they support what the university is doing and reaching out to people. So we hope you'll consider that. There's an envelope on the chair should you choose that that's something you'd like to do. We'd be very grateful. We're very proud of the Sam and Helen Style Center for Jewish Studies. It's been thusly named since, I think, 2009. And with that, a wonderful renovated building. Have any of you visited the building on Downer? It's impressive. It's very impressive. And I know Joel is always eager to have people come and visit, so I'm going to extend that to you. The university, you may have heard some news about us lately. I don't know if you're aware, but we've had some great news for our chancellor, who's moving just across town. But I also want to reassure you that during these changes, and we wish Chancellor Lovell the best, during these changes, the kind of work and the offerings and the education of our students will continue at the exceptional level it always is. And so we're all going to be we're all very proud to have you here and to be UWMers. So we're just, all of us are going to continue to move forward and I think on to greater success. So thank you very much for hearing my message. Enjoy the program.
Thanks very much, Anne. So I'm going to do a couple of my usual things that the regulars are used to. First of all, just tell you about a few things that are coming up, and one is in just a couple of days also connected to this workshop. Very, very special concert, Saturday night, 8 o'clock. Hankus Netsky and Hebrew National Salvage are going to play they really take us on a musical tour of the Yiddish theater. Hankus Netsky is one of the great pioneers of klezmer music, among all kinds of other things that he does, and a great teacher and a great mentor. Our own Miriam Chaya Siegel, who is speaking tonight, is actually performing with him. Our friend Lauren Sklamberg, who was here just last year with the Klezmatics, another little band he has, the lead singer, and he's going to be performing, and several other really fantastic musicians. So do come back on Saturday night, free concert, 8 p.m. in the Arts Lecture Hall. In just a very short time, April 6th, we have a film in the Latin American Film Festival, The German Doctor. It's Sunday evening, and it's is it 7 o'clock, Union Theater. And a few days later, April 9th, really fantastic writer, Arab-Israeli writer who writes mostly in Hebrew, Syed Kashua. He's a novelist, a columnist, a television writer, is going to be here. We're going to screen a couple of episodes of his very interesting satirical program, Avodah Aravit, Arab Labor, and he's going to introduce it, and our own Tasha Oren, who is a scholar of media, including Middle Eastern media, is going to moderate a Q&A with Mr. Kashua. So it's going to be a really amazing event. And otherwise, we have feedback cards. If you're not already on our mailing list and you want to be, do submit one. And we always like to hear what you think of our programs. We also always do a drawing to encourage you to submit completed responses. So the prize that a couple of lucky winners will get tonight for turning those in is a wonderful memoir, Jacob Adler, A Life on the Stage. Jacob Adler was one of the great stars of the early professional Yiddish theater in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he's also the patriarch of a great theater dynasty that includes a couple of generations, people like Stella Adler, the great acting teacher, and her brother Luther Adler. So, and it's a really wonderful read. It's not dry at all. This is a guy who left a pretty comfortable civil servant job in Odessa and started becoming, he became a prize fighter, and then he started following the Russian opera and started getting into fights over that, and then he just sort of moved over into the Yiddish theater and became one of the great stars of his age. So it's really a lot of fun. Let me tell you a little bit about this project, and then we're going to jump right into some presentations. A couple of years ago, Deborah Kaplan and I started daydreaming out loud about putting together what we called a dream team of scholars who could come together and explore the world of digital humanities, which is expanding and taking off at a dizzying rate, and marry that to the study and preservation of Yiddish theater. And so we were thinking about people who collectively command the languages that are really critical to know, to really study Yiddish theater seriously, particularly, besides Yiddish, obviously, Hebrew and Russian and Polish in particular, but there are various other languages that it's very helpful to know, including Romance languages and German, of course, and other things. And also people who come to it from a lot of different perspectives, from people trained in European history or music or comparative literature and other things. And a number of the people in this group are librarians who are all also very scholarly themselves in their orientation. And so In the time since, at the moment, we now have 14 people in this group. There are 4 who unfortunately couldn't be with us tonight, but 10 who fortunately can. And we're spending 3 days, today, tomorrow, and Saturday, a lot of the time just sitting around a table and figuring out where we're going next, what kinds of projects we'll take on. And we can talk a little bit more about, if you'd like, in the Q&A. You'll get sort of glimpses of discussions of that in the presentations. But I asked everyone in the group, I didn't want to just sort of come and be off in a room, as fun as that is for us. My children think it's really strange, but it's fun for us to be sitting around this room, talking about Yiddish theater all day. But I also wanted to take advantage of these people who are all such dynamic speakers and wonderful teachers and offer something to the wider public, hence this evening. And so the charge that I gave to my colleagues and to myself was what I initially described as 5-minute talks. I loosened things up a little bit, and I said we can go up to 6, but after that, everyone, including me, gets the hook. So 6 minutes max. Anything you want to talk about related to Yiddish theater and performance, and just have at it. And the topics started coming in, and so we're simply going to go. We're not going to sort of introduce the individual presentations because the introductions would end up being longer than the presentations. So you have the programs on your seats. You have very short bios of everybody, and you have titles. And we're just going to go down that list from Aaron Rubenstein through Francesco Spagnolo, and we're going to do our thing, and then we'll have a chance just to hear what you think and hear your questions and talk and have a conversation about all of this material. So, Aaron, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you'll get the ball rolling. Enjoy.
Thank you, Joel. When does my 5 minutes start?
Whenever you say.
All right. Let's get this up. Great. Okay, so my talk is going to, I think, play a similar role to the role that bread and olive oil plays on the table of a nice Italian restaurant. So I'm hoping to satiate you just enough so that you can enjoy the real food that's about to come. So to that end, I am going to focus more on the digital aspect of what we're doing and try and contextualize a bit this term digital humanities that Joel had mentioned. This is going to be a very broad overview and probably also superficial, but I'll dive in. So research, using computers to do research in the humanities is not a new thing. So as early as 1949, Roberto Busso, who is an Italian linguist and theologian, teamed up with Thomas J. Watson, who's the founder of IBM, to index and make searchable all of the work of Thomas Aquinas. And he used that text, and he used those computers to do complex linguistic analysis. In 1987, Gregory Crane, who's a professor at Tufts, created the Perseus Project, which made available all of the classic works of antiquity, so works in ancient Greek and works in Latin, and exposed them in a way that they could be searched, and dictionary definitions of these ancient languages could be integrated with the text itself. And basically sort of starting a revolution of computer text analysis in the humanities. So we have these old examples, and a lot of the work that Roberto Busso and Gregory Crane started has become in a way sort of commonplace to the point where I can go to Google Books and I can do a search in the entire corpus of digitized books for the terms digital humanities and see the frequency and dates at which they occurred. So I did that in advance of this talk, and unfortunately this only goes up to 2008, but you can see that even though that there's been all of this work with computers and humanities, around 2000, 2001, all of a sudden you see the emergence of this term digital humanities, and then it just skyrockets. And if this chart went up to 2014, it would climb even higher. So why is this becoming so popular? Well, there's a few reasons. The first one is the World Wide Web. So here's the very first website that Tim Berners-Lee published in 1991. What Tim Berners-Lee was able to achieve was a platform for open content, right? Open being the key word here. Anyone with an internet connection could tie into this network of content. You also find on this platform around this time the proliferation, of digital libraries, right? And these digital libraries focused on digitizing primary resource content, right, from all kinds of different collections and making them available on the web, basically democratizing access to these digital resources. The other thing that you find, and this is a particularly recent development, is that a new generation of faculty and especially graduate students use computers for everything that they do. And they start to realize that, hey, I can actually turn these computers towards my scholarly work and towards my research. And you see things like this article in the Chronicle of Higher Education that's actually literally calling for graduate students in the humanities to learn computer programming, right? So they can make use of some of the tools and strategies that were developed by Roberto Busso and Gregory Crane. You can also see that as these amateur programmers in the humanities start to be unleashed on the world, that there's tools that they can use that are really designed for amateur programmers that allow them to take all of this information that's openly available and start engaging with it in new kinds of ways, and even visualizing it, giving them an opportunity to have different perspectives into what was normally a text-based discipline, right? So, in the end, you end up with sort of very interesting amalgamations like this one, right? So this is from the University of Virginia. This is from the Hotchkiss map collection, which is the Civil War maps of important Civil War battles. Here you have an image from a map in the special collections that was digitized that's integrated with geographical software. So this old map functions just like Google Maps does, right? You can zoom in on it, you can pan around. You can also layer on top of that Hotchkiss's own annotations and make them interactive, as well as a visual timeline visualization that allows people to dig into the timeline of events and see how they influence certain events as they're displayed on the map. Right, so why is this interesting? Because this shows that not only is the approach of using computers for research been democratized, but also the results of that scholarship has been democratized. Right, so instead of just necessarily publishing the results of scholarly work in journals, you can see interactive results of this scholarship available to the general public in a way that engages them and brings them in. So the future of digital, right, and the future of digital humanities specifically has the potential to bring new people in, right, to shine lights on exhibits and on teaching and sort of form a new generation of interest in the humanities. That's it.
Hi, it's so nice to be back in my home state. I was born and raised in Madison, so I'm really excited to be here. Oops. Okay, well, F5. Oh, hast du mich geraten. Okay, so the Broder singers were the first professional Yiddish singers. Oops. There we go. So basically, Nama Sandro, in her book Vagabond Stars, talks about them as troubadours or secular barchonim. So prior to that, basically, Jewish entertainment was limited to prescribed religious occasions, so Simchas Torah or a wedding, sometimes on Purim, they would have a Purim spiel, but there wasn't any performance of music or drama outside of that context. So they were the first ones not only to take performance, Yiddish song and a little bit of drama into a public space, but to do that out of the realms of a religious occasion. And they really established the foundation for the Yiddish theater. So they started in the mid-1850s, and by the time Avram Goldfaden founded the Yiddish theater in 1876, they were among the first actors in the Yiddish theater. So people ask, why are they called the Broder Singers? A lot of them were associated with the city of Brod in Galicia, and in particular there was one man named Beryl Broder who was very famous. Some say that he founded the Broder Singers, others says that it was another guy named Kovke Dubinsky. There's all kinds of theories, and we may never know. But people started to call themselves Broder Singers because it became sort of a generic name for this kind of entertainer. So their early performances were very informal. They performed in wine cellars, bars, and restaurants. People, I don't know about the performers, but the audience was often drunk. They were there to drink, to eat, to have a good time. It was very informal. People could make requests. And really the audience felt that the performers were people from their own class. There wasn't a big barrier between the audience and the performers. People could make requests. They could even say, can you please sing the song again and again if they really liked it. And the costumes were extremely primitive. And when I say primitive, I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to, dress as a chassid, I'll just borrow his capote and I'll, borrow his outfit. But some of the other things they did were, for example, chewing on paper, on red paper that candy came in to make their cheeks red. So they had nothing, but they came up with these costumes. And then they would basically just ask for an honorarium by passing the hat at the end of their performance. So Pepi Littman is one figure that I'm really fascinated by because she actually was born in the 1870s, and so she came onto the scene of the Broder Singers somewhat later after they had already been established. And I don't have any documentation of this, but the Broder Singers were originally an all-male group. But I think that when the Yiddish theater began, it used to be completely male for a short time, although men would, dress as women. People soon demanded to have real biological women. And by 1877, a year after the Yiddish theater was founded, there were already competing accounts of who was the first woman to be in the Yiddish theater. So Pepi Littman was born right around that time, but in the late 19th and early 20th century, she became really an active and popular performer. People would go crazy for her. As you can see, she dressed in male drag, both as a sort of modern dandy and as a chassid, and people just loved her. And not just Jews, actually. It wasn't only a Jewish audience. Non-Jews would also come to the show and enjoy. So I'm going to play for you a recording, if I can do this, of her singing a song called the Apikorsim, which means the heretics. So basically she's talking about what's going to happen when the Messiah comes and the people that aren't being nice and frum, what's going to happen to them. And so, you better get with it. You better put on Hasidic clothing and start acting like a real Jew because you're going to really be in trouble when the Messiah comes. No shine. And this recording is from around 1910, I believe. She actually was so popular, she went on tour all over the place, and she even performed in the United States, which is where I believe this was recorded. So just to tell you a little bit more about the repertoire, it really came from a variety of sources. One thing that was unique about the Broder singers is that they actually created some of their own material. They wrote their own material, both dramatic material and musical material, but they also plagiarized and appropriated a lot of stuff. If you've ever heard of the Yiddish folk poet and bard Velvels Barscher, a lot of people said that basically they stole his material. But you can actually find some published sources of Berel Broder and other writers descended from him and people who worked with them, which I used in my research. Also, I found a lot of wonderful biographies and autobiographies of actors, early recordings like the one I just played. Even in the repertoire of contemporary singers, I've actually heard versions of the song that I played for you. So it's amazing that after maybe 100 years, this material is still being used. And I'd just like to say that I hope that one of the things we had talked about was what materials we could put online, and actually think that the stories of people like Pepi Littman and others are wonderful. Like I found a story of an early Yiddish theater performance when Yiddish theater was forbidden, and they actually had to say it was in German, but it was really in a kind of Germanized Yiddish. And people were really excited about seeing the show, but they couldn't afford it. So instead they watched the show on the roof of the building, which had a hole, but they fell in through the hole during the performance and landed on the stage. So this is the kind of stuff you can find in memoirs. And thank you. I hope you will enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Nope. Okay, Mac user here. F5. Of course, F5. All right. The last published volume of the Lexikon von Jiddischen Theater, the Encyclopedia of the Yiddish Theater, which I'm sure you all know, begins with a question frequently asked of its editor, Zalman Silberzweig. Wann wird sich schon endigen, der Lexikon von Jiddischer Theater? And the phrasing has the suggestion with that schon that since he began working on it in the late 1920s, and here it was 1969, maybe it was time to wrap it up. But of course there's also a terrible poignancy to this question. Not just about when the encyclopedia would be finished, but when the art that it chronicled would come to an end as well. The last published volumes of the encyclopedia are full of endings, especially volume 5, of the murders of Yiddish actors in Europe, of the deaths of American Yiddish actors whose passing takes a little bit of the life of the Yiddish theater with them. And in his foreword, Silberzweig is careful to distinguish between something that is ended and something that is finished, because nothing is ever truly finished. Knowledge of discrete events and phenomena continues to be generated and expanded upon long after the original event has passed. So in all the endings that the encyclopedia chronicles, we can also see the art's beginnings and its continued reverberations in the world today. These are out of order. The majority of biographical entries in the encyclopedia give an artist's name, date, and place of birth. There are also photos, lists of tour dates, productions they were in, and even the very briefest entries provide material for a family tree. The encyclopedia could be the basis for a genealogy of the Yiddish theater itself. We could map its journey, its landmarks, its players, and connect these with the places from which the Yiddish theater came and with which it was intimately connected. The genealogical map of the Yiddish theater might look something like that of the genographic project. I don't know if anybody's done this. It's a genetic study sponsored by the National Geographic Society, and it features an interactive map of the human journey out of Africa, where you can see the emergence of different haplogroups in space and time. It's very cool. And I wonder if we could do something similar for the Yiddish theater. We know that the Yiddish theater began in Eastern Europe, as Miriam Chaya tells us. We have these fixed points of origin, like Jascha Handgarten in Lemberg, or various taverns in Odessa, or, of course, Jassy in Romania, where Avram Goldfaden got his start in stand-up comedy. And we can use the biographies in the encyclopedia to add points to the map. If Jassy is Africa, this is where we can start. And along the way, we can ask the public for help. How many people are actually out there today, maybe many of you, doing family research on a particular name or a place that could be added to our map? There are many, many excellent family history websites, and it must be possible to connect these with the Yiddish theater's own family history. This is one of the many excellent Jewish genealogy sites out there. Gesher Galisha gives you an idea of the wealth of documentation about Jewish life in Eastern Europe. There's archival materials, photographs, census data, maps, biographies, newspapers, everything you could want for an electronic Yizkor book. Very typical is you can search by town. You can just scroll over each town, and this is a random screenshot. You can choose a town. I chose Czerwonograd because I can pronounce it. And it gives you families and maps and photographs. And in theory, you could get people to add their own data points to our Yiddish theater genealogy. They could add names and faces and places, and we could kind of triangulate the development and expansion of the Yiddish theater. Disparate information, an account of a company's tour, reviews that name actors, family letters that mention seeing a show in town, could, in the aggregate, enrich immeasurably what we know about the day-to-day workings of the Yiddish theater. You could scroll over a town like Czerwonograd and be offered a menu of names, theaters, traveling companies, musical links, images. And I think by crowdsourcing most of the information in this genealogy of the Yiddish theater, both the form and the content would demonstrate something that those of us who love the art already know about it. That people didn't just watch the Yiddish theater, they were the Yiddish theater, and they still are. The people who were its audience, its actors, its playwrights, its designers, its directors, its crew, its front of house, have left a trail for us to follow, so that we can be a part of the story too. Thank you.
In 1888, the first school for Yiddish actors was supposed to open in New York. It never did, but it did not vanish without a trace, for the 4-page document that articulates its rationale and rules has survived. Historians have all manner of curiosities like this in their files, items that catch your eye, but don't fit neatly into your master narrative at the time that you come across them. Digital humanities methods can help keep track of these materials and make connections one might otherwise miss. The would-be founder of the school, Avram Goldfaden, would not have been just any headmaster. 12 years earlier in Romania, as we've heard, he laid the cornerstone, like that. He laid the cornerstone for professional Yiddish theater by establishing a ragtag troupe, creating the repertoire, and simultaneously serving as director, designer, and composer. Yet when he came to America, along with vast swarms of other Jews fleeing Eastern Europe, the father of the Yiddish theater failed to repeat the sort of success he enjoyed in the old country. Yet, for a brief time, he clearly dreamed of becoming the father of Yiddish actor training as well. Here's how the school, aimed at the swelling ranks of Jewish workers on the Lower East Side, was to work. Students would pay tuition for courses in acting, singing, instrumental music, and dance. The latter three categories cost 50 cents a month. For acting lessons, male students would pay $3 a month and women $1.50. For every 10 paying male students and every 5 women, Goldfaden would offer free tuition to a needy or particularly talented student. He also planned to establish a working theater connected to the school, and students would reap a share of the profits, staggered according to different categories of actors and singers. Goldfaden, or Professor Goldfaden, if you please, would receive a 10% share. The document suggests that students would come out ahead by this arrangement, for part of the school's rationale was for participants to, quote, improve their material condition, unquote. At least as important was a more spiritual goal. I decided, writes Goldfaden, to found a dramatic school in which workers would not wander around idly after work and expose themselves to moral corruption, but rather spend their free time on singing, performing, and other ennobling activities. Ennobling? Remember, the year is 1888. By this time, the Western tradition had chalked up about 2,300 years, making a case for the immorality of plays and performances. Playwrights are liars. Viewing imitations of reality corrupts the spirit. Theaters are where scoundrels, whores, and pickpockets congregate. Lock up your daughters when the actors pass through town, and when the actors die, for God's sake, literally, bury them outside the cemetery walls. Well, you may be thinking, much of the Western tradition is Christian. Maybe Jews just appreciate theater more. Not so much. While Christian Europe, starting in the late Middle Ages, saw performances once connected to church ritual break away to create a rich theatrical universe that no longer felt obligated to reinforce religious teachings, Judaism was doing its level best to make sure that theater didn't happen at all. And it basically succeeded while allowing one outlet with certain restrictions, like no actresses, on the Saturnalian winter holiday of Purim. No professional Yiddish theater, though. The rest of the time, no actresses and no guys in dresses, hence, almost by definition, no theater. So Goldfaden was swimming against the tide in proposing theater training to better the actor's soul. Not all tides, mind you. There's also a notable minority tradition in Western theater, from Aristotle to Tony Kushner, that sees the stage as a source of healing rather than harm. In Jewish terms, though, he was presenting something fairly novel, because there's not really such thing as free time in traditional Judaism, where, at least for men, the opposite of labor isn't leisure, it's Torah study. In Goldfaden's world, actor training can be seen, in a manner of speaking, as the new Torah study. Keeps you out of trouble and worth doing in its own right. What is perhaps more remarkable is not what preceded Goldfaden, but what he preceded. Much as he was remembered as the father of the Yiddish stage, his plan for a conservatory cum ensemble was arguably even more visionary. At around the same time, a clerk for the Paris gas utility, André Antoine, was establishing the Théâtre Libre, the mothership of the art movement that would blossom over the next few decades. In short order came the founding of a number of similar institutions: the Freie Bühne and Freie Volksbühne in Berlin in 1889 and 90, London's Independent Theatre Society in 91, and the Moscow Art Theatre in 1897. Central to all of these companies was the professionalization of the actor, which Goldfaden emphasizes as well. Show up on time, follow directions, get off book in a timely fashion, stay in character, treat dress rehearsals like performances. May sound obvious now, but the fact that similar rules keep popping up during this period in various languages suggests that such things needed saying at the time. In 1888, the same year Goldfaden's school was to open, Moshe Finkel, manager of the Oriental Theater on New York's Bowery, published a 16-page booklet containing 82 rules for his actors. What was required, what was permissible, what was streng verboten. Sometime when you have 5 minutes to spare, I'd like to tell you about it.
Okay, if F5 gets us where we want to be, how do we get out of this? Thanks very much. Okay, let me introduce by saying 1888, where we've just come to with Joel. Is the heyday really the golden age of Yiddish theatre in New York, of course, but in general, it's really as the theatre is growing of age. Thank you so much. And one of the kind of key features of Yiddish theatre in this period is that it's a forum really as it functions as a community marketplace. It's a place where events get discussed. It's a place where people go to the theatre, then they pour out the next day in the markets, in the workshops. They talk about what they've seen. And one of the key things that the theatre was used for to inform and educate about were historical events. And a lot of plays were written about biblical subjects, about themes from Jewish history, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and so on, and then more lately, the Russian Revolution, life under the Tsars, and so on. And I'm going to just take a snapshot of one of the really huge events that featured as a theme for Yiddish theatre, which was the Dreyfus Affair. In France, they simply called it l'affaire, the affair, because it was so well known. It was one of the great scandals and court cases of our time. Think O.J. Simpson, think Mandela walking out of Robben Island. The Dreyfus Affair, which runs from 1894 to 1906, is an enormous world event, a huge talking point. Dreyfus is of course, an army officer, a Jewish army officer in the French army, and out of the blue, he's accused of being a spy on behalf of the Germans. He's put on trial, and in short order, he's convicted and sentenced to solitary confinement on Devil's Island off the coast of South America. An enormous scandal, a huge source of shame potentially for the Jews of France and worldwide. And very quickly, this becomes a big hit in the Yiddish theatre. So here we have the Windsor Theatre on the Bowery, 1898. 1898 is when anti-Semitic riots are raging in Paris. This is a case that fractures France along religious, class, political lines. For decades, I mean, even recently, 1994, a senior figure in the French Army archives said the Dreyfus Affair was about the presumed innocence of Dreyfus. He was forced to resign. 1994, it was a massive scandal. So, Kapitan Dreyfus is the title of our play here, and you see the image of Dreyfus in this peaked cap becomes as well known as Charlie Chaplin as the tramp a couple of decades later. It's an absolutely iconic image that becomes known the world over. Another play at the same time, October 1898. And by the way, these two posters are part of a digital project that's in a way a model for us and a pioneer for our subject of the New York Public Library, Miriam Chaya's institution, which has put up a fabulous collection of its Yiddish theatre posters online. So you can search them, you can zoom in on them and pick out all sorts of these wonderful hyperbolic phrases that they use to talk up the attractions that you can see. So this is Kapitan Dreyfus, oder die Geheimnisse von Paris, Captain Dreyfus or the Secrets of Paris. This was a massive cover-up, this case, which ran on through trials and retrials for years. Now, one of the interesting things that we've been talking about in our discussions to date and will continue to talk about is the material that isn't online, the known unknowns and even the unknown unknowns of our subject. And here we have the Standard Theatre Shoreditch in London's East End. This is a poster that I managed to buy 6 weeks ago from one of the huge playhouses, Victorian playhouses of the East End of London. This is around 1899. I came across a review from around this time of exactly this play in this theatre, which said, "The uniforms were far from correct and consisted mostly of a compound of German trousers, English coats, and French peaked caps," which, of course, was ludicrous. That was the opinion of the reviewer, but it was a very, very popular hit. So much so that the guy who played Dreyfus lived for years on the profits of the play, and here he is. Here's Dreyfus from the poster. a little bit of blurb that says this play needs no publicity, darf keine Reklamen. It's so well known, 25,000 people have been to see it already, which was probably true. So successful was it that the same company takes Dreyfus to Paris, the Eden Theatre in Paris. This is a poster that hangs on the walls of the Medem Center in Paris, a wonderful Jewish library, not online, so interesting for our subject. You could only see it by going to Paris and looking at it on the walls of the Medem Library. One of the things we need to do is try and bring these resources together so that they're searchable and put them in coherent categories for us and for anyone who's interested. And one of the plays, I just included this, which also spins out of our subject, because one of the Dreyfus plays was called Kapitän Dreyfus oder Emil Zola, the writer who famously created one of the most famous headlines of all time, J'accuse, when he really lambasted the French establishment over this cover-up, was forced to flee France after being convicted of libel. And so the Jewish anarchists in the East End of London create a periodical named after Zola's novel, Germinal. And this is what this is here. So, to sum up, we know something about the way Dreyfus was a hit on the Yiddish stage. We don't know very much about some of the playwrights who wrote these plays. There were at least 6 playwrights who did versions of Captain Dreyfus. We have very few stage photos, but maybe there are some out there. We don't know too much about the audience reaction, but it's pretty safe to assume that many of those who saw these productions, one of the people captivated by the Dreyfus affair, of course, was Theodor Herzl, creator of political Zionism, founder of political Zionism, and we can assume that many of the people who went to the Dreyfus plays later joined many of the Zionist movements. So the theatre was extremely influential in shaping people's thinking and the sort of allegiances and movements that they later joined. I think I've said enough. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Faith Jones. I am the federally mandated Canadian content. There's a couple of Canadians present. Excellent. So I'm going to be speaking about Winnipeg. Winnipeg is a city not unlike Milwaukee, pretty far from the major Jewish centers with its own very particular regional history. It did sport a very active Yiddish-speaking Jewish community. And there was a newspaper there which, among other things, did discuss Yiddish theater. This is from, as you can see, November 24th, 1911. So this is a weekly newspaper, and they just ran all kinds of information about theatrical news and advertising. And some of it's about English, some of it's about Yiddish, some of it's other things. On the far right, you see an announcement about Metterlink getting the Nobel Prize. On the left, there are English language theaters. Some of them are silent movie houses. Some of them are vaudeville. And in the middle, the Queen's Theatre, we see an announcement for a Yiddish traveling theater troupe. And so, what are they playing? They're playing Chaim in America, The Bowery Tramp. In the middle there, we have an announcement about Der Leberdicker Mess, which I'm going to come back to. I'm going to just point to it. And then we've got Voice from the Grave and The Jewess or The Jewess. It's in 2 different languages. It's in Russian, Żydówka, and then it's Die Judin in German. So it's, anyway. So those are the plays. And so there's a traveling troupe that's coming through town, and this is what they're putting on. They're putting on 5 shows. So they play one weekend. They play the first 2 shows. Then on the following Wednesday, they play the Leberdicker Mess, and then the following weekend they play 2 more shows. So what they've got on the Wednesday there is the big serious show. It's running on a Wednesday night, not on a weekend. It's the more serious of the works, and it is the person whose troupe it is starring in this, and that's Benny Schengold. We've got some of the experts in Yiddish theater in this room. Ever heard of Benny Schengold? Not a lot. No, nobody's heard of Benny Schengold. So poor guy. This is who we've got, and what he's playing in is Tolstoy's late play, The Living Corpse. So this play, very interestingly, this is just about 6 or 8 weeks after it opened for the first time anywhere in Europe, and here it is in Winnipeg. It's already opened in New York in Yiddish, which was the first New York production of it. In New York, it's got Jacob Adler, whose book you could win, in the title role. In Winnipeg, it's got Benny Schengold. So Benny Schengold was a supporting player. He had played with Tomaszewski's troops and with Bertha Kalish. He usually played the young lover, not a leading role, because he was very, very, he was a babe. He was good looking, so he usually got the part of the young lover. But here he's the headliner, and he's here with his own troupe. This is the Queen's Theatre, where it would have taken place. Yiddish theatre was almost always performed in the Queen's Theatre on Selkirk Avenue, in the real heart of the north end of Jewish Winnipeg. It was not primarily a Yiddish theatre. It mostly played English, Polish, Ukrainian, a little bit of Yiddish here and there. Now, as you can see, it is a church, or as they call it, a worship center. This neighborhood now, and very much in economic distress, and organizations like this are primarily helping organizations. So no more theater for the rather magnificent Queen's Theatre. So there was no dedicated Yiddish theatrical location in Winnipeg. There was also no critic. There was no drama critic on the Yiddish newspaper. So it's quite hard to know what people made of these performances, because we don't have a critic. So we have the advertising saying they came, but then what did people think of it? So I found one audience reaction, which it was published in this book, which was published in 1951, but it's actually a letter to the editor that appeared in 1939. This is Esther Schechter, who wrote this memoir, and in it she includes her own letters to the editor that she sent in over almost 50 years of living in Winnipeg, and all her letters to the editor with all her opinions about various matters, and she had opinions. All of them are expressed in all their glory. So here is, I'm going to read it out loud quickly. My heartfelt thanks to so it's dated from 1939, I think, this particular reaction, much later. My heartfelt thanks to the brilliant artists Jacob Ben-Ami and Bertha Gersten for the spiritual pleasure that I took in all three of their performances, and particularly in The Living Corpse. Complete coincidence, it's the same play. And Nora. I do not have the power to express myself like a reviewer. They have been praised by all the critics from the largest Jewish and non-Jewish newspapers in the States. This is yichus. This means that they really are. These are important people. They even play in the United States or wherever they have appeared. I hope they will continue their art. It's great use to all humanity. Blah blah. It's very painful to me that the Dramatic Union, which is the culture bearer for us here in Winnipeg, did not give a bouquet to Bertha Gersten on Saturday when she had so artistically performed her role, and so on. So, I love this woman. She's always nasty. So at this point, Yiddish theater is much later. It's 1939, I believe. The Yiddish theater is in decline. We have a much bigger name. Jacob Ben-Ami is coming through instead of Benny Schengold. And, I think that partially accounts for the somewhat starstruck tone of the letter. It's just a letter I cannot imagine appearing in the Forverts or in a newspaper in a city where there were professional reviewers who were there to tell you what to think. People here had to have their own reactions, and in some ways they're quite unsophisticated, and she acknowledges that she doesn't have any of the kind of background of a Yiddish reviewer, of a theater reviewer, and yet she is performing that role by making this kind of public intervention on behalf of the artists, supporting the artists who came through Winnipeg. And it just tells such a Winnipeg story that this letter even appeared. So my question really, in thinking about the Winnipeg dynamic and the materials we have available for a city like Winnipeg, is how are we going to make this story of the Yiddish theater live in the digital realm, because there is nothing about this story that can be researched in depth. Everything we know is going to be very small little snippets of information. So it's not as easy as, well, we've found a play script and we're going to digitize that, or we can write somebody's biography. These are really very minor people in the history of Yiddish theater. And in terms of the audience reaction, we may find a few sentences here and there, for example, in an oral history interview, but even the people who saw those plays are gone now. So how do we recover this history? It's just a question about the contextual world of this kind of Yiddish theater. Smaller troops, less important actors going to these outlying areas, and I just think that the ways we find to make those stories visible might be quite different from the ways we research and present in the digital world, the big centers of Yiddish theater. Okay, Zachary, you're up.
It occurs to me, listening to Faith, that there's a story, of course, to be told about Milwaukee's Yiddish theater, which had quite a long-lasting tradition in this city. I'm going to be talking not about a historical topic, but about a resource for historical research using Yiddish digitized newspapers, and specifically the Historical Jewish Press Project, which is emanating out of the National Library of Israel in collaboration with the Tel Aviv University. This project, the Jewish Press Project, started roughly a decade ago with the digitization of 19th century Hebrew newspapers, and more recently it has expanded to include, at this point, 4 Yiddish newspapers. 3 daily newspapers and 1 weekly, all of them from Warsaw, going back before World War I up to 1939. In fact, the newspaper Unser Express, which you see at the bottom of the screen, the last issue that you can look at on the screen is September 3rd, 1939. You can look at these newspapers in different ways, that is, use this tool in different ways. You can look at them issue by issue by issue. This is the newspaper Heint, one of the premier dailies, Yiddish dailies in Warsaw. This is just a more or less random look at the title pages of Heint, front pages. And then you can filter. Over on the left you see that pull-down menu, and filter by the specific titles you want to look at. And then you can conduct a search. And this is what a search result screen looks like if you're just doing a kind of, this was just a throw it out up in the air and see what happens, and I used the term in Yiddish, theater, which you have to input in the Hebrew alphabet. And you see actually the bar graph that this is the number of hits with the term theater, the number of articles that have, or the number of results that show the word theater by 5-year span. Then I tried, Yiddish does not have, or it does have a standard orthography, but almost nobody uses it. And if you spell Yiddish with the letter hey in it, as opposed to without the hey, you actually get some hits when you make that search as well. Not as many, but there are a few, especially in the older period. Now, you can't really, well, maybe you can see this. The text below these headlines, if you look closely, you'll see that this is the very, very dirtiest of dirty optical character recognition. And so that leads to the question that digital humanists ask themselves, can this resource be used for text mining? And I would say with caution at best. So on the top, you see this bars, and you see that there are different things you can look at and show, articles, pictures, ads, different. And so this is an example of what happens when you search and decide to sort by pictures on the term theater, and you see a bunch of random pictures, which can be blown up. And we mentioned Ida Kaminska, and this is actually her parents' theater, the transformation of Kaminski's theater in Warsaw into the Frankfurter Theater, and it's no longer an American-style theater. And here is another blow-up picture of Esther Rochel Kaminska, who, when you visit her grave in Warsaw, I think the heading is Die Mame. This is the mother of the Yiddish theater. Oh, and you can see also that the picture is Esther Rochel Kaminska, but for some reason the square is a different picture, and that tells you that this site is still something of a beta. So I'm going to skip through that and bring you to some ads. And these are ads for productions. I searched under the name Esther Rochel, and this is what I got when I clicked on ads and pictures. And these are examples of pictures somehow or another. I don't know what those two guys are doing there, but there must be a reason. And then relevance rankings, something that we librarians think about. And then here is a page view of a newspaper. This is the death of Esther Rochel Kaminska. The article is highlighted. And then I just flipped the pages to the front page, and then in the lower right-hand corner you see the big black box announcing her obituary and many other advertisements on the front page. I'm not going to go into the Wilner Truppe search phrase, but just to let you know it's there. And finally, just to conclude, because the optical character recognition is so dirty, I would advise anyone using the Historical Jewish Press Project, or specifically with these 4 Yiddish newspapers, to also consider using in tandem I would call it a curated index, the index of Yiddish periodicals, index 2 Yiddish periodicals, also coming out of in this case, the Hebrew University, and what you can do when you do a search there, you'll actually find a lot more results than you'll find because in the Historical Jewish Press Project, and this is just one random search of under their subject heading, and it gives you some examples and what a citation looks like. Unfortunately, this is not full text, so you really have to go from the index back to the Historical Jewish Press Project to get to the article itself. And there you are, Hamlet Struggles. And this is the production of Hamlet in the Teatr Polski in Warsaw, a Yiddish review of a Polish language production of a play by Shakespeare. What can I say?
Okay. So since my name doesn't appear on the screen, I'll just introduce myself very quickly. I'm Deborah Kaplan. I'm an assistant professor of theater at Baruch College, City University of New York. And I will be talking about the Wilner Troupe and mapping, as you can kind of see behind me. So I'm going to begin with just a moment of confession. My interest in digital humanities began out of a moment and a place of sheer frustration. I had become interested in the high art aesthetic movement that we've heard alluded to a couple of times, called the Yiddish art theater movement, which was sort of in tandem with the art theater movement that Joel was talking about a little bit earlier. And I decided that I wanted to write about the company that seemed to me to be at the center of every artist, every actor, every director that I was interested in. They all had some connection with this company called the Vilna Troupe, and so I went to go find, let's find a book about the Vilna Troupe or some sort of documentation of the Vilna Troupe. And what I found was deeply frustrating. I was intrigued by the absence of the material, by the ways in which material that I was finding was contradicting other material that I was finding, and I was also sort of deeply frustrated. So in the beginning, based on sort of just the preliminary sort of scanning the extant historical record, I believed that the Vilna Troupe was a sort of small and discreet theater company, much like many other Yiddish theater companies of the period, that was made up of a distinct core group of artists and that had a particular geographic trajectory. But once I began digging into the archives, I started to discover that this was not, in fact, the case, and it was really precisely the opposite. The Vilna Troupe was more of a kind of a brand name that was used by hundreds of actors and directors over the course of about 20 years, staging productions in multiple locales, often simultaneously, and often feeding off of the publicity surrounding other productions. So instead of tracing the development of a single theater company, which was my original idea, it seemed sort of a discrete task, I suddenly found myself trying to figure out and trace the history of a multifaceted cultural and theatrical phenomenon that operated across 5 continents and that included most of the 20th century Yiddish theater world in its sweep. So I had what we might call a big data problem. So I started to try to organize this data. In classic sort of Jewish rhetorical fashion, I found myself answering one question with another. Who was part of the Vilna Troupe? Well, who wasn't part of the Vilna Troupe during this period? That became more the question. In seeking to understand the Vilna Troupe as a kind of discrete theater company, I was asking all of the wrong questions. And it was only when I began to think about the company as a kind of broad-based cultural phenomenon or a kind of template that was A, profoundly transnational, that is to say, not based in a single place and thoroughly itinerant, B, structurally unstable, not based on any particular individual or group of individuals, and C, always perpetually sort of homeless, that it all started to come into focus. So the shift in my own thinking about this project was really enabled by digital tools and methodologies. And I'm kind of offering this as an example of how we can think about the sort of reciprocal relationship between these tools and technologies and the work that scholars do. Sometimes scholars do scholarship and then put it into digital form, and it's a way of getting people to read or interact with information in a new way. But I think often, what we're seeing more and more is that the process of digitizing material and thinking through it digitally enables new connections and ways of thinking that can crack a subject wide open, that is difficult to do and maybe even impossible with sort of traditional tools. So this is kind of the example that I want to propose. One of the aspects of what I started to do, one was to build a database of actors and their relationships to one another and where they were in any given time, and that's sort of an ongoing project that I won't show you because it's a giant Excel document that if you print it out, it takes like 50 pages to print. But the other side of it is I started mapping out where these actors were, where these companies were, and trying to really trace their movements. That's what I just want to show you today. I used Google Earth, which, if you've ever explored it, is a very easy-to-use platform, but you can also embed things on top of it. And I used it to sort of translate geographical data points that I was finding into a dynamic and interactive color-coded map that documented the movements of various Vilna Troupe companies. So in a nutshell, the story of the Vilna Troupe is that there was an original company called the Vilna Troupe, though that wasn't their original name, but they came to be called the Vilna Troupe, and then a series of quarrels and disputes and misbegotten love triangles and affairs and elopements split the company into various branches, and that persisted over the course of many years. So there were many different Vilna Troupes, all of whom claimed that they were the only Vilna Troupe. They all used the same logo. They all had more or less the same repertoire and style, and everybody, the actors, the critics, the audiences, were frequently confused about whether there was one Vilna Troupe or multiple multiple Vilna troops and who actually was a part of this thing. So that's kind of the Vilna troop in a nutshell. So let me show you what I kind of put onto a map, and you can kind of see what I'm talking about, I think. So at first, for a couple of years, the Vilna troop, let's see if I can get, there we go, was a small company in Eastern Europe with kind of a clearly defined tour circuit. And you can kind of see this is kind of the original Vilna troop. A couple of years, they had a clearly defined tour circuit. They circulated around these cities. They were a discrete group of 15 to 20 people. That didn't last very long. There was a complicated love triangle and elopement that led to the establishment of two distinct Vilna troops. So one, which I've called the Azaron Alomis Vilna troop, because they were the couple that eloped and kind of the sort of centrifugal force that propelled this particular iteration of the company. They traveled from Eastern Europe throughout Western Europe and then ultimately around the United States and Canada. So you can see this over here. And simultaneously, another branch of the company that I've called the Maslow Vilna troop, because he was sort of the centrifugal, charismatic personality behind this company, was traveling a tour circuit in Eastern Europe. And sometimes these tour circuits overlapped, often they didn't. But to sort of the casual theater goer or a person in any one place at any given time, it just seemed like the Vilna troop was everywhere all at once. And reviewers would often joke about opening up your newspaper in the morning and finding reports. Last night the Vilna troop was in Bialystok, and then today they were in Paris, and tomorrow they're going to be in New York. And how is this even possible, right? It sort of added to the mystique of this company. How could they be in so many places at once? They actually weren't, but they were kind of a brand name, and they were using that publicity to fuel their sort of explosive success. I call them an interwar viral phenomenon, and I think that's basically what they were. They were viral before there was viral. So here's two Vilna troops touring simultaneously in the 1920s. By the late 1920s, you have three more or less discrete Vilna troops that are touring simultaneously, operating from Odessa to Los Angeles, roughly, and sort of everywhere in between. And then several more Vilna troops emerged during the 1930s, but many of these companies travel the same kind of established tour patterns as the other ones. Often they're kind of mashups of various people from Vilna troop companies together. They call themselves a Vilna troop. They're performing for a few months. They fold. Another company starts up. But there's another way of thinking about the Vilna troop that I think is equally compelling, and I think the map kind of shows us how this works. The other way of thinking about the Vilna troop is the way the actors thought about the Vilna troop. And the actors, if you read their memoirs, you read their letters, they thought about the Vilna troop as something that they and their entire careers were a part of. So adding to the confusion, the actors write about the Vilna troop as they trace their own pathway through this network of various theater companies. So the actors would often switch from one company to the other for various reasons, personal, financial, but they write about it as though they were part of the same company all along. And they would travel to places on their own and do solo shows, and they would use the Vilna troop logo and repertoire and advertise themselves as so-and-so of the famous Vilna troop company. So they used it, again, to kind of gain traction. So if we think about the Vilna troupe as just including, as they do, kind of the career sweep of these actors, we start to see a much more complicated global picture. If we add in the career trajectory of the husband and wife acting team, Joseph Buloff and Luba Caddison, who were among the founding members of the Vilna troupe, they're in purple over here, and we can see how the territory starts to expand. They go back and forth across all around South America, Buenos Aires. They go back and forth between the U.S. and Eastern Europe. And it's kind of a back and forth travel pattern that they adopt, cycling through these various troops. If we add in another actor who I've kind of been tracing, Jacob Weislitz, who is in orange here, his pathway, he ends up spending quite a bit of time in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and then he ends up spending a lot of time in Australia and New Zealand, but he still makes similar tour circuits to some of the other actors. So he kind of expands the territory again, and we could do this again with other actors. So I'm just going to zoom out for a second. This image, to me, I think shows just one aspect of the kind of global interconnectedness of Yiddish theater that we all, I think, know is there, but at least as Yiddish theater scholars, but not everybody else necessarily knows just how globally interconnected Yiddish theater was. The Vilna troupe is but one example of Yiddish theater as global theater.
Oops. Come back. In January 1942, a Bundes leaflet in the Vilna ghetto declared, "You don't play theater in a cemetery." But about the same time in the Warsaw ghetto, Jonas Turkov wrote, "Who could imagine that in such a situation and under such conditions, a time could come for cultural work?" But Jewish stubbornness this time too remained unbroken, and within the narrow frames, with bridles on their mouths, after every blow, or better said, in the pause between one blow and the next, the people rushed towards life. Unquote. For 20 months, from the sealing of its walls in November 1940 until the Great Deportation of July-September 1942, some 400,000 people lived and died in the Warsaw Ghetto. Beginning in July 1942, 300,000 of them were herded to the so-called Umschlagplatz and forced onto trains bound for the death camp near the village of Treblinka, where within hours they were gassed and incinerated. So the purpose of my current work is to review and reflect upon the vast range of performance in the Warsaw Ghetto during those 20 months. I focus on several sorts of venues. First, the 6 theaters with an annual attendance of several 100,000 that the Germans permitted in the ghetto. Second, the more than 100 cafes frequented by smugglers, gangsters, literati, and the occasional ordinary Jew, including The Pianist, if you've seen that movie, right? And third, the thousands of plays and concerts, semi-legal and illegal, professional and amateur, many for children, organized under the auspices of the Alleenhilfe, the self-help organization directed by the historian Emanuel Ringelblum. My main sources are 2 witnesses whose writings have been partially preserved in the archives of Oinig Shabbos, the clandestine organization also created and directed by Ringelblum, established to document every aspect of Jewish life in German-occupied Poland. These materials, a portion of which were dug out of the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto after the war, some of them in the milk can, which you may have seen exhibited at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. These materials are now available in digitized form through, first of all, the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, where which was my source, probably also through the Holocaust Museum in D.C. and Yad Vashem in Israel. So let me just tell you a little about the 2 sources. And here you have the first of them. This is a typescript created by Jonas Turkov. His name is on the upper right. Warsche weilt sich. Warsaw entertains itself. Produced during the period of the Warsaw Ghetto. Jonas Turkov had been a major figure in interwar Yiddish theater in Poland. He and his brother, the celebrated actor and director Zygmunt Turkov, dedicated themselves to the development of a modern Yiddish dramatic theater that could compare to the greatest contemporary European theaters. While Jonas, like his brother, was a fine actor and director, he was also a theater activist who struggled around 2 issues. First, to encourage the growth of serious theater and undermine the contemporary outpouring of operettas and vaudeville, of little social significance, this genre that was known as Schund, meaning trash. So he fought that. The second was to fight for Jewish theater in Yiddish rather than in Polish. Both these goals were grounded in a commitment to the development of a theater that could serve as a cornerstone in the building of a modern Jewish national culture in Poland in the Yiddish language. Turkov found himself in the ghetto along with his wife, the singer and actress Diana Blumenfeld. They miraculously managed to survive the ghetto. And this, as you can see, this is an 18-page manuscript, which I think is extraordinary, to have on my computer. This is one of the miracles of this whole business we're talking about today. Let me close this and open one other document for you. Don't do that. No. Here, I can close it now. Okay, that's good. I got it. Okay, now the second one is these are the first few pages in Polish. The title is Warunki Powstania Teatrów, the situation under which theaters in the ghetto arose. These are just the first two pages. Other pages are not quite this bad. Fortunately, they've been copied over into Polish, and that's what I was using. I wasn't using this manuscript directly. And just a bit about the writer of this. We know much less about the second writer, Stanisław Różycki, a Warsaw native. He probably had been a secondary school teacher before the war. He was in Warsaw during the German bombardment of the city, fled to Soviet-occupied Lvov, and returned to Warsaw just before the sealing of the ghetto. A member of Ringel Blum's Oynek Shabbos group, which consisted of about 20 people, writing clandestine reports about every aspect of life in Warsaw and generally in German-occupied Poland. Różycki wrote about everything he encountered, including street life, theaters, and cafes. He has these incredible detailed descriptions of who's sitting in these cafes and what class of people they represent, and with penetrating precision in a fine literary Polish. He was probably murdered during the Great Deportation or somewhat later. So all I can say is the digitalization of the Ringel Blum archives is just a major feat, and the fact that we can, that someone in Warsaw can just click and send me these documents is an extraordinary thing. Thank you.
I'll close it. So I was a couple years ago in San Francisco at a digital humanities gathering, lots of geeks, and there was this request for people who wanted to present even shorter presentations, not 5 minutes but 3 minutes, and they were called the Dork Shorts. So I think that's what we're doing tonight. Dork Shorts. How do you say dork in Yiddish? And so let's see. Is it going to? Yeah, here it is. Okay, somehow. Yeah. So for tonight's presentation, I tried the little experiment. Between 1997 and 2001, before I left Italy, I conducted extensive field work on the revival of Yiddish and klezmer music in the country, interviewing a whole lot of people and covering the various bands. It was a very, very thriving scene for a number of years, and eventually published an article in a quite prestigious journal, the Italian Journal of Musicology, which is kind of an odd thing because it's a journal that usually publishes about Vivaldi and, you get it, right? So that kind of stuff. So it was interesting that they were interested in this at the time, and an indicator that it was actually quite a cultural phenomenon In the article, I predicted that the phenomenon would somewhat fade over the years, and it kind of did, although it remained somewhat constant. So what I did for this presentation is I went over my research using mostly what is available today online and see whether I learned the same, I learned more, I learned different things. So that's the experiment tonight. But before I do that, I wanted to just share a little Twitter conversation. I don't really like PowerPoints, but I do like the PowerPointing. So here it is. This is the Yiddishkeit Los Angeles Twitter feed, and they posted a reference to one of my favorite Itzik Manger songs. And they put it with a photo of this lady and a little mouse. The song refers to mice. And so I wrote back immediately, hey, you're bringing Yiddish back to its Italian roots. Because the photo are Topo Gigio and Raffaella Carrà, 1970s Italia TV icons. And so this would be the point in which I would start a completely different presentation and explain to you how everything you've ever known about Judaism actually comes from Italy. But I will not do that. I could, but I won't. The topic of Yiddish theater and klezmer music in Italy has been studied by various scholars. Here is a short list for different perspectives. The study of klezmer music, Fiddler on the Move, has a section by Mark Slobing, has an important section about Italy, about an Italian performer. I'll be talking about that in a second. Laura Mincer works mostly on Polish-Italian comparative studies. Ruth Gruber, in her study, in her book Virtually Jewish, covers Italy extensively. And I worked closely with Ruth while that book was, and also my essay was being written pretty much at the same time as her book, so we traded cards a lot. There is an Italian scholar of Jewish theater, and especially Yiddish theater, at the University of Siena, Paolo Bertolone. You see me at the bottom of this list. And I think my interest is very much on the sort of global circulation of Jewish ideas, especially musical ideas, but not only. But most authors have focused on Moni Ovadia. Here you have a little quote from the website about Jewish theater. It's an aggrandizing quote, and pretty much any coverage of Moni Ovadia, whom I know very well, a Sephardic Jew from Bulgaria, who has dominated Jewish culture in Italy for the last almost 20 years, and who performs in Yiddish a lot. So most of the scholars focus on Moni Ovadia and what he has contributed. However, why am I out of this? I'm not supposed to be out of this. Okay. Oh, very good. Here, let's go back. However, what I found out, and I had some sense of this back then when I first researched this, but I was really able to prove this point much more by doing very quick research compared to 4 years of field work, maybe 1 hour of online field work, about 14 years apart, was the fact that this revival is very much an Italian, Israeli, and perhaps American affair. And it's a revival that begins with the revival of Italian folk song in 1964, a show called Bella Ciao. Here is a little excerpt. Note the singing with the guitar accompaniment, a certain type of arrangement, vocal arrangement, choral arrangement. Let's forget the Google ads. So this was a theatrical presentation at the Festival dei Due Monti in Spoleto in 1964 of Italian folk song. If you notice, I've highlighted a character in this play. I didn't put it here, but online in an obscure website I was able to find. That was the only time I was able to find the original billboard for this presentation, which also was very politically contested, etc., etc. It was a big case in Italian culture. But one of the performers is Hannah Roth. Now, we find Hannah Roth. Now, where are we? Here. Let's go to the next slide here. We can do that. Yes. We find Hannah Roth as one of the musical minds behind a very important adaptation of Yiddish and Hasidic culture in Israel just a few years later. Ish Chasidaya was a play staged by the Teatron Bimot, and that had hundreds of performances over many years in Israel, and that presented Hasidic Judaism to Israelis in a way that was understandable within the parameters of popular culture in the 1960s. A tagline for this presentation was Hasidut bejeans, with Hasidim wearing jeans. And here is an excerpt. Again, the entire LP of the show is available on YouTube in the YouTube channel of Mr. Dan Almagor, who puts it all online. So it's a primary source of sort. Again, the guitar. This is a Hebrew translation of a very iconic Yiddish song, Mashke. I hope you can hear it. And you hear the exact same kind of arrangement of the musical material that you just heard in the Italian revival. Hanarot is the link between these two performances and these two theatrical productions. She was born in Florence, Italy in 1939 of Romanian parents, and she lived after World War II between Italy and Israel. She's an important figure in Israeli culture, but also seminal figure in Italian Jewish culture. In 1969, she was teaching at the Jewish high school in Milan, and she produced with the students. It was a very cosmopolitan community. A lot of immigrants from Eastern Europe went through Milan, and some of them stopped there instead of moving either to the States or to Israel. So it was a station in the migration of refugees and survivors after World War II. So in 1969, with these students, she organized the production of Ish Chasidaya, in which she reintroduced the Yiddish. So she took out some of the Hebrew and went back to the Yiddish. And among the students' performers were Moni Ovadia and Mara Cantoni. Mara Cantoni is the director who will create the stage persona, Moni Ovadia, who will go on to represent Yiddish theater and klezmer music in Italy in the decades to come. Let's fast forward to 1995. So the course of the Yiddish theater revival and klezmer music revival in Italy has sort of happened, is already quite an established feature. It's interesting that in 1995, just to give you a sense of comparison, two productions of the book take place, one in New York City and two adaptations actually of the book take place in one in New York City, the other one in Milan. New York City with text by Tony Kushner and music by the Klezmatics. And it's a book that's very much focused on the connection between Ansky and the American immigrant experience. In Milan, these heirs to this transnational Italo-Israeli connection produce a book that will tour Italy and will become a very, very successful production that mixes Ansky with Itzhak Katzenelson and refer directly to the Holocaust. So use the book as a metaphor of the ghost of the victims of the Holocaust. Here are just very quickly some examples. Again, everything from YouTube. This is Klezmatics in a medley of songs from the book. And this is Lawrence Bamberg, who is going to perform here on. I'm just staying with the dork short timing here, but This is a fragment of the book from Milan. You see actors, musicians wearing uniforms of inmates of concentration camps on stage. Interestingly enough, the music that informs the textual adaptation of Ansky and Katzenelson is entirely drawn from the American revival of klezmer music. So something has happened there. In particular, I believe at some point, I don't know if I can cue it exactly there. Let's see. But here, this is the Ersterwald, which was taken directly from the Klezmatics recording of this song, not from the older recordings of this Polish tango. However, the Dybbuk in Italy has an even earlier story. You see, I will try and prove you that the Dybbuk comes from Milan. Not really. However, it's actually very interesting that there is quite an interesting precedent to the Dybbuk in Italy, and it's an operatic adaptation that opened at La Scala in 1934. It was an adaptation from Ansky by two non-Jewish authors, a librettist and a composer, Ludovico Rocca. You can hear just a little fragment of this. You could hear the entire production from a edition, and I think a 1982 edition that was done again on YouTube. So that presenting the Dybbuk in Milan was already a loaded local history that in a way goes even back beyond the revival of Italian folk song that I pointed to. By the way, if you follow the link here, you will go, and we can try and do that. You can go to the Internet Archive where you can leaf through the score of the opera. Where is it here? It's all there, so you can see it there. But to conclude my presentation, let's see if I can do this again. There are a few points that I want to make. First of all, that the genesis of the Italian revival is clearly pre-digital. However, it also it grew through the circulation of the electronic music market, and so the CDs from New York eventually started to arrive. First started with LPs of the Klezmorium, etc., and they were repurposed for specifically theatrical reasons. The global aspects that the previous presentation highlighted so well are very much present here. We see how there is a circulation of ideas that needs to be mapped. The advent of digital resources changed the scope of the revival, and in most cases because it basically made no difference between primary and secondary sources. Everything arrived and was used at the same level. Something I find very interesting is that the enormous availability of online materials coincides with a decrease of the activities of the revival. And I'm sort of thinking, reflecting upon this research, that I think that the ability to access original sources and not mediated or not secondary ones makes local markets a lot less relevant and global ones a lot more relevant. The other important thing is that the role of individuals in preserving history is emerging through the internet. Most of the sources that I presented come from the characters in this play. Dan Almagor in Israel, Mara Cantoni in Italy, who has created her own online archive of all her work that maps the revival of Yiddish theater in Italy. And the fact that, it took me about an hour to completely rethink and highlight one specific link, the role of this Romanian-Italian-Israeli woman, Hannah Roth, in this whole production, which really did not emerge as well during 4 years of field work on this topic. Thank you very much.
Don't leave yet. There's more. Figure it out as we go along. Yeah. Is it on? I'll make sure it's on.
Okay.
You're on now.
Okay, so thank you everyone. And obviously, all over the map, literally. And we're happy to just take some questions and talk for anyone to ask some things. So, yes.
Is there a particular programming language that the humanities people are learning? I mean, there are a lot of different programming languages. Is there one that you guys are all kind of agreeing on?
Programming languages. Yeah.
Any favorites that you're...
Personal favorites?
Yeah.
My personal favorite is the Python programming language, which is
Python is the digital standard.
I will claim that. There's a lot of programming languages have evolved to a point where they're a lot more accessible to people who aren't computer scientists. So there's a number of languages that are fairly easy to pick up and have with them a lot of tools that you can do the kind of analysis that we've been alluding to and we've also talked about. I prefer Python because it syncs well with the way that I think. And I think there's other languages too that work well with.
Yes.
Have you done any looking into the Yiddish theater here in Milwaukee? Who various people were involved with that?
I have not, but if somebody wants to take that on, I'd love to do a comparative study.
Yeah, I know that Chaim Yablokov did come here. Chaim Yablokov, or Herman Yablokov, who wrote the song Poppy Wilson, if anyone ever heard that song. He actually, he wrote a 2-volume memoir, which is fascinating. It's also available in English. And he did write in there about doing like a longer run in Chicago, but on Sundays he would come up to Milwaukee. I think this was in the 1920s or 30s.
My husband's grandparents were involved in Yiddish theater here in town. And the name is still important in music. I think it's possible it's next Thursday.
Speaking of theater of all, I should, this is Pinchas Paul Eldridge, who is a distinguished alumnus of this university and also an alumnus of the Perhift Theater, the long-running Yiddish theater company in Milwaukee.
It was the longest running amateur Yiddish group in the world. We were started in 1921, where people like Tepper and Howard Weinschel were the first ones. And we played for 50 years. We played in different cities, in Chicago and New York, and we were called the Perhift Theater. And it stood for Parents Hirschbein Volkstheater, Perhift. And we're written up in the anthology of Yiddish theater, and we have a distinct part of Yiddish theater in the world.
How long were you involved with it?
I got out of the Army in 1946, and I got into that immediately until we closed in 1972. And we did some pretty good stuff.
Have you written an account of that time, or has anyone interviewed you about it?
I believe so. Yeah. I'm probably one of the only ones left. I'm stubborn. That's called an auction in Yiddish.
There was a theater called the Rose Theater in Milwaukee.
At 6th and Wallace.
Right, and my father had some theaters, and when he had it, it was already the African American neighborhood. But at the Rose Theater, Paul Muni played when he was in the Yiddish theater.
His name was Muni Weisenfrank at that
So
time.
years, amazing. But I have another question about the Vilna troupe. There is an Israeli playwright named, I think it's Joshua Sobel, and one of his most wonderful plays, which played in Chicago, and I went to see it, was about a diary of one of the troupe members from that. I think, do you know much about that, about him?
So I believe that it's of a different company. I haven't actually seen the play, but I've come across it. And it's not. There were many other theater troupes in Vilna, many which had the name Vilna and troupe in their names, but sometimes other things in between. So it gets a little bit confusing because there are a number of theater companies who have somewhat similar names, and that's, I think, a situation that many of us encounter in our research, that we have people who are changing their names, companies that change their names, and then similarities.
But he really made and he's really an important playwright, and he kind of immortalized the Vilna, that time in Vilna with the theater.
I think Michael's maybe going to say that.
Just one word. Sobel's important play, is about playing theater in the Vilna ghetto. So, and that, a very powerful play, but it's not about the Vilna troupe, that we were talking about this evening, but it's about playing theater in the
Vilna, is it still there today, or does it have
Vilnius.
Does it have another name?
Vilnius.
Vilnius.
It's not Jewish names.
Is it in Poland or Russia?
Lithuania.
Lithuania?
Yeah.
And was it Lithuania in the olden days
It
too?
was Poland between the wars, and it was in the Russian Empire before that, and it was in the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania for hundreds of years before that.
And just to add to that, Vilna, during the time that the Vilna troupe was founded, during World War I, Vilna changed hands 9 or 10 times during the war. So it's been in a lot of countries and under a lot of different powers at different times.
My grandmother was supposedly born in Vilna, and so I never could figure it out what exactly or where.
Just one thing about towns, that Vilna, of course, was a big city. It was a big Jewish city, a big city. But people sometimes ask, is this town still here? Is that town still there that my ancestors came from? All those towns are still there. They didn't vanish off the map. They're just not Jews living in them anymore. But towns haven't vanished, okay, just in general. And you can find, you have a town, you can find it on a road map in Poland or Lithuania or wherever.
Thank you.
Bruce. I know that the purpose of this conference is technical, the digitalization. But I couldn't help but remark just how much your collective research deals with the secularization, the creation of an international Jewish culture from the 1890s, where the Yiddish King Lear, for God's sake, with Dreyfus, he wasn't Lear, had nothing to do with it at all. So it's a mix. It's many different elements in it, and yet you see it progressing and reflecting the culture of the people who made that alive. Yes.
Yeah, that's a great observation, Bruce. And one of the things that various of us have written about, and our colleagues have written about and talked about, is the way that you can see in the kinds of documents that we spend lots of time with in people's memoirs and in newspaper reviews and all sorts of things. This ongoing tension between what does it mean to have a Jewish theater, because as I suggested, this is not something that is as a sort of year-round phenomenon. It goes back very far in Jewish tradition, and so as this emerges, this is also a time of all kinds of national, where national cultures are really kind of asserting themselves, right? And so people's sense of themselves as we have an important culture to sort of bring to the table. An important secular culture, as you observe, is really important, but at the same time, there's a certain ambivalence about it, because we want there to be something, or at least some of us want there to be something Jewish about it, but we also want to be able to do, Lear, or we want to do Ibsen, or what everyone else is doing, and depending on the personalities involved in the particular historical moment, how people look at those questions really varies. And some, of course, individual people may feel one thing about it at one moment and change their mind depending on what's going on all around them.
An anecdote: one of the most amazing Yiddish theater reviews I ever encountered was by the Sephardic chief rabbi of Buenos Aires in 1930, reviewing a production of a play by Strindberg in Yiddish, produced by the touring actors from North America, one of them being Stella Adler. And he says, "I have never in my life seen Strindberg played as well as I have with Adler and Goldenberg."
I have two questions, and neither one is digital.
That's okay. You're allowed.
That's still okay. As far as the Warsaw Ghetto Yiddish theater, you said that the two leaders of that theater miraculously survived.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what happened. What did they do after that?
Yeah, well, Jonas Turkov and his wife Diana Blumenfeld survived on the so-called Aryan side of Warsaw, where they lived in hiding. I don't know the details of how they got out, but in any case, Diana, Jonas Turkov was a major figure in pre-war, and also he was the one who worked for Emanuel Ringelblum's group and set up a lot of this theater in the ghetto. Diana Blumenfeld was a wonderful singer and actress. They came to New York, and she didn't live very long. She died in the 50s, and he lived very long and worked as an archivist for YIVO in New York. He lived to be about 90 and died in 1989. So that was, their survival was a whole separate extraordinary story. He wrote a lot after the war. He wrote a book about his survival. He wrote other books. And one of the things I did was compare this document to what he wrote after the war. And there's some interesting details in this document, such as that one of the theaters was open very late at night because it was near one of the gates of the ghetto. There was all this smuggling going on at night. Huge amounts of it. So this is things like that he chooses not to talk about, when he writes more, post-war. I don't know. I really don't know about that. I know he was involved, he worked for YIVO. I don't know how much. I would assume that he was a little bit after, but I don't know about that.
I have a question for the Italian. I'm just interested in the whole Yiddish-Italian thing, and so much in America, in English, that Yiddishisms have become part of
say to begin with the other way around. Yiddish, if you read even Wikipedia about the history of Yiddish literature, you know, do yourself a favor and see where it starts. It begins in Italy, and as an adaptation of Yiddish literature, as an adaptation of Italian literature into Yiddish, and there are a lot of Italian terms in early Yiddish texts. So that's to begin with. Yiddish-speaking Jews in Italy who were present in it. So I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about 500 years ago, 16th century. There were Jews speaking Yiddish who lived in Italy in the Italian ghettos, and they abandoned Yiddish relatively soon. Within 100, 150 years, they stopped speaking Yiddish. However, some Yiddish words remain in the Jewish languages of Italy. Because of the revival, there are some terms that have become part of common knowledge. And I would say most of that has to do with the attempts to elaborate on the Holocaust, as I should say, since we're talking about that context of the Shoah, because that's the key word there. So there are some Yiddish terms that are part of that discourse that have become, including the very word Yiddishkeit. Yiddishkeit is a word that's used commonly in the press, etc., to refer nebulously to.
But even in a words like schlep or
No. Those words are not. No, Italian doesn't have those words.
I'm intrigued by the Dreyfus plays, because I remember Professor Berkowitz, you did that talk about the Vilas case. And apparently the plays, you said, evolved as the Vilas case itself evolved in the news. Did that happen also with the Dreyfus?
Absolutely, that happened in the Dreyfus case. So, Dreyfus was first arrested in 1894. He was brought out of Devil's Island in 1899. The Zola letter in 1898 produced another set of evolutions of the affair. He was retried, famously Dreyfus, more or less acquitted in that retrial, but not finally pardoned until, I think, 1906. So at every stage, certainly in those early years, the plays were updated. In fact, the London poster includes a bit of text that says this play has had a number of new scenes added to it to reflect the most recent events of the retrial in Rennes, notably. And so it was continuing. It was a fabulous vehicle for the theatres and the companies, precisely because of what you say. It could be and was adapted and updated at every twist and turn of the plot. It was being played. I found a reference to it being played in London as late as 1920. Very possibly beyond that, but yes, it was continually evolving.
And these guys wrote fast. I remember many years ago when I was working on something else, scrolling through, and I forget which point in all of that. As David said, it was a long process, but coming through, there was some new development in the case. He was reconvicted or something like that. And let's say that the headlines came out on Wednesday, they were immediately, the following weekend, they were advertising new. So, the playwrights are picking up the newspaper at the kiosk and running home and writing it in 24 hours and handing it to the actor. It was really, incredibly quick process because, basically you were being schooled. It's pretty much very much tied to that sort of, you need to be the first one to get that play on stage.
Is there any surviving Yiddish theater now still in our country?
Sure. In New York we have the Volksbühne, which is the longest running Yiddish theater in the United States, which began in 1915. We have a Volksbühne. We also have a theater called New Yiddish Rep, which is sort of more like a Yiddish art theater that was founded maybe in the last 5 or 6 years. And there's also Yiddish theater in Montreal and in Romania. There's a state Yiddish theater. In Israel, there's the Yiddish Neo. Paris also has a Yiddish, an amateur Yiddish theater. There's a little bit going on in Melbourne, Australia. From time to time, Warsaw also has a Yiddish theater. And I feel like I'm missing. I don't know what else. England?
Are you able to understand it if you go to the theater?
Well, they have super titles in English and Russian.
They do?
Titles, translations.
Okay, but do you guys understand it?
We can't do this research.
Thank you. I just wondered what people think sort of the future, or what the next steps are in terms of the digitalizing of the research, and maybe what some of the challenges, obviously speed is benefit, but just a little bit about how digitalizing of this stuff has changed, how you teach, how you research, how you think about Yiddish theater.
Sure.
I mean, I think we've talked about it as kind of the Wild West and kind of the frontier, and there's this feeling, I think, for anybody working in sort of digital humanities scholarship, that we're also trying to sort of figure out what it is, what are the best practices, how can we use it, how does it impact our research and our teaching. So I think that those are all sort of questions that are open for all of us and for anybody kind of working in this way. I mean, I think one thing that is true that has come up in just kind of anecdotal conversations is that at a lot of our institutions there's a tremendous interest in online teaching, hybrid classes, things like that. Several of us have been working in that realm. And so, you know, as I'm working on developing this hybrid course right now, and what's available online is what ends up in the module for the course, right? Because having content that's available means that content is something that I can use and leverage in that way. So I think that that's another thing that we haven't really talked about yet so much, but if we create tools and ways of accessing this material that are geared towards students and geared towards teaching, that, you know, maybe not just us, but other people teaching like Introduction to Theater might just throw in a little Yiddish theater unit in the theater history unit where it generally doesn't end up, but, you know, I think it should.
I would say, just to be very brief, I think in terms of opportunities, digital access, and especially the advent of social media, are radically changing how we conceive knowledge. And knowledge is becoming very much a collaborative process, and it's eminently collaborative process, and non-hierarchical. Okay? So that's in terms of opportunity. So in this case, you can imagine that it was great that the available archives are in Michael's computer, but when they are online, they are accessible to all of us and beyond, and each of us can contribute a different perspective and sometimes clarify details that no one else can see. So that those are among the opportunities. The challenge is that there seems to be an ease of access for what is digitally available that sort of hides everything that is not being yet digitized. Or they may not be digitized, because not the entire universe will be digitized. And so what is not digital, so there is a kind of digital divide that makes certain and may cause certain very relevant pivotal aspects of the culture to vanish from collective consciousness because they are not available through a Google search.
One more, just underline something that you said before. I still think it's amazing. I mean, I do a lot of teaching online too, and that I can just drop a song, an image, a piece of
text linked up to what I'm teaching. It's just an amazing interchangeability of all this stuff. It's all information, and it's all easily accessible. It's just an extraordinary thing, and easily communicated.
I just want to add a bit too to the challenges. One of the things that I think has become increasingly clear, and this is something that I think we've talked about even today to a certain extent, is that a lot of these projects can take up a lot of resources, right? And determining what are the most valuable projects for the resources that we have available is a huge challenge, I think. And one of the things that's been sort of exciting for me to see is watching a bunch of eminent scholars sit around the table and figure out, all right, what are sort of the most critical types of material that you're making, right? And how do we add the most value to that in the most efficient way? And there's going to be trade-offs, right? There's going to be projects that might not be possible because of the amount of resources necessary. But trying to set that foundation is I think part of what actually happens.
I'll just add one additional thought to that, which is there's also this question of sort of what material should be presented, and so many questions about how. You can put some, as someone was saying today, anyone can just sort of upload something to the web. For one of the things we were talking about in our discussions today was that there's so far there really isn't a place online where you who were a student of mine can sort of go and find something that is going to give you a fairly good big picture. You find lots of different little bits, but where do you find something that's going to give you some sense of what Yiddish theater was all about? So that's a question for us. Do we want to actually create that sort of introduction online, or and any material that we get involved with? We all browse all kinds of places. I'll throw out one example: the Museum of the City of New York, which has really lovely dozens and dozens, if not a couple hundred, probably several hundred photos of Yiddish theater in New York. But there's no narrative, and there's no attempt. I'm not faulting them. There's no attempt to sort of create a narrative for that. And there's, you find this actress, a few pictures of her on one page, and then 5 pages later you find some other pictures of her, and we can sort of construct a narrative as people who work on this stuff, or someone who is kind of a layperson who stumbles across this. Okay, those are kind of nice pictures. What do I do with that? So those are some of the questions that we struggle with also.
Just to add to that, I think one thing that we talked about today is that so many of the people that we work on have such amazing stories. And there are so many amazing stories that we're kind of constantly coming across that are so deeply exciting and compelling. And I think we're all kind of envisioning something that tells those stories in a way that people can really access and understand, because I think there's an audience for that. They're just interesting stories.
Just to add that whoever wins the Jacob Adler memoir will be richly rewarded, because it's a fabulous read, but also you get a sense from it with so many of these figures, the Turkov brothers and so many others, are immensely sophisticated minds. These people lived in a cosmopolitan, multilingual world. Most of them were trilingual, as a minimum, very, very often speaking 5 or 6 languages. Jacob Adler knew Russian theatre intimately. People like the Turkovs knew Polish theatre intimately. So I think for all of us, we get very frustrated by the sense that ours is a sort of fiddler on the roof, corner of sort of interesting but rather primitive folk studies. We're aware that we're dealing with is an extremely sophisticated set of people, repertoire, and a subject that in a way, for us, it's, I think, at the sort of heart of Jewish studies and links into so many interesting areas within Jewish studies.
I think we couldn't have a better thought on which to end. So thank you again for coming this evening. Hope we will see you again on